Female CEO yells at black single dad for touching her $1 million supercar. Seconds later, he fixes it. The sleek lines of the midnight blue McLaren P1 cut through the dying light of dusk like a knife through silk. Victoria Sterling pressed the accelerator just enough to feel the 903 horses beneath the hood purr with restrained power. The digital speedometer climbed effortlessly past 70, then 80, the world outside becoming a blur of amber fields and telephone poles. She glanced at her Patek Philippe watch, 6:47 p.m. The investor meeting was at 8:30 sharp, and she still had 40 miles to cover. Not that she was worried. Victoria Sterling hadn't built Sterling Dynamics from a garage startup into a billion-dollar tech empire by being late to meetings. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was racing through rural backroads in a $1 million supercar to discuss her company's latest breakthrough in autonomous vehicle technology. The fuel gauge caught her attention, nearly empty. She'd been so focused on leaving the city that she'd forgotten to fill up. A rookie mistake that would have cost her dearly in her early entrepreneurial days. But now it was merely an inconvenience. Her fingers danced across the car's touchscreen, searching for the nearest gas station. Riverside Gas and Go, 2.3 miles ahead, the sultry British accent of the navigation system announced. Victoria wrinkled her nose. A small-town gas station wasn't exactly where she'd planned to showcase her automotive masterpiece, but necessity trumped preference. Besides, she'd be in and out in 5 minutes. Grab a coffee, let the attendant fill the tank while she made a few calls, and continue on her way. The gas station materialized out of the growing darkness like something from a Norman Rockwell painting, if Rockwell had painted during the LED era. 4 pumps sat beneath a canopy of harsh fluorescent lights, casting everything in stark white relief. A modest convenience store occupied the center, its windows glowing warmly with displays of snack foods and lottery tickets. The whole place had that authentic small-town feel that city planners spent millions trying to replicate in urban developments. Victoria pulled up to the premium pump, the only one that made sense for a car like hers. The McLaren's engine settled into its characteristic idle, a sound that was part whisper, part growl, entirely mesmerizing. She'd keep it running, of course. The start-stop sequence in a car like this wasn't something you did casually at random gas stations. Besides, she had calls to make. Through the store's large windows, she could see a man behind the counter. Tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of broad shoulders that spoke of physical work rather than gym memberships. His skin was deep brown, and even from this distance, she could see the careful way he moved, economical, precise. He was organizing something behind the counter, probably getting ready to close up shop for the night. Victoria stepped out of the McLaren, her 4-inch Louboutin heels clicking against the concrete with military precision. She wore a charcoal gray power suit that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, tailored to perfection by a Savile Row craftsman who had dressed 3 generations of Sterling women. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized her angular cheekbones and the kind of bone structure that suggested both intelligence and ruthless determination. The man at the counter, Marcus, according to his name tag, looked up as she entered. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with kind eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. There was something about him that didn't quite fit the small-town gas station stereotype. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the fact that his uniform, while clearly well-worn, was immaculately clean and pressed. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying just a hint of a southern accent. "Beautiful car you've got there." Victoria nodded curtly, already pulling out her phone. "Premium unleaded, fill it up. I'll be making some calls." "Of course. I'll take care of it for you." She was already dialing her assistant when Marcus stepped outside. The investor call couldn't wait. Jennifer Chern from Quantum Ventures was notorious for changing her mind if deals weren't locked down immediately. Victoria paced beside her car, one hand pressed to her ear to block out the ambient noise, the other gesturing as she spoke. "Jennifer, I understand your concerns about the timeline, but our beta testing has exceeded every projection. The algorithm adapts to driving patterns 67% faster than our closest competitor." Marcus moved toward the fuel pump, but something made him pause. He tilted his head slightly, like a dog hearing a frequency just beyond human perception. The McLaren's engine was still running, its 12-cylinder heart beating with mechanical precision, but there was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. A faint rattle, barely audible above the engine's sophisticated symphony. Most people would never notice it. Hell, most mechanics would miss it in a car this advanced. But Marcus Reed had spent 15 years of his life listening to engines, learning their languages, understanding their secrets. And this particular sound, this almost imperceptible metallic whisper, was one he knew all too well. The timing chain was beginning to fail. Marcus felt his stomach drop. In a standard car, a failing timing chain was expensive but manageable. In a McLaren P1, with its incredibly tight tolerances and exotic materials, it could mean catastrophic engine failure. The kind of failure that would total the car entirely, turning a $1 million masterpiece into a very expensive pile of scrap metal. He glanced at the woman, Victoria. He'd caught her name during her phone conversation. She was completely absorbed in her call, pacing back and forth in her expensive heels, gesturing emphatically as she negotiated what sounded like a multi-million-dollar deal. She had no idea that her automotive pride and joy was potentially minutes away from becoming a very costly paperweight. Marcus looked back at the McLaren, its sleek body gleaming under the harsh lights. The sound was getting slightly more pronounced now, and he could see the almost imperceptible vibration in the engine bay. Time was running out. He'd seen this exact scenario play out before, back in his racing days. A team owner's prized Ferrari, purring like a contented cat right up until the moment the timing chain snapped and turned the engine into modern art. The owner had been devastated, not just by the financial loss, but by the destruction of something truly beautiful. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped closer to the car, leaning slightly toward the engine bay to confirm what his ears had already told him. The rattle was definitely there, and it was definitely getting worse. He had maybe 10 minutes before the chain would reach the point of no return. He straightened up, preparing to approach the woman with his concerns. In his experience, car owners, especially owners of cars this expensive, appreciated being warned about potential problems. It was the right thing to do, regardless of how she might react. What Marcus didn't anticipate was how Victoria Sterling would interpret the sight of a gas station attendant leaning over her $1 million supercar. "Jennifer, let me call you back," Victoria said abruptly, her voice carrying a new edge that would have made her competitors take notice. She lowered the phone and fixed Marcus with a stare that could have frozen molten steel. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice cutting through the evening air like a blade. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Marcus froze mid-step, his hand still extended toward the McLaren's gleaming hood. Victoria Sterling strode toward him with the purposeful gait of someone accustomed to intimidating boardrooms full of stubborn executives. Her heels struck the concrete with sharp, staccato beats that seemed to punctuate her rising anger. "I asked you a question," she said, her voice dropping to the kind of controlled fury that had made grown men in Armani suits squirm during hostile takeovers. "What gives you the right to put your hands on my car?" Marcus straightened slowly, raising his palms in a gesture of peace. "Ma'am, I wasn't touching anything. I just heard." "You heard what exactly?" Victoria's eyes flashed dangerously. "You heard an opportunity to get your fingerprints all over a vehicle that costs more than you probably make in 5 years?" The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Around them, the gas station's evening customers, an elderly couple filling up their Buick, a young mother wrangling 2 kids while pumping gas, began to notice the commotion. Heads turned, conversations quieted, and Marcus felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up his neck. "I understand your concern about your car," Marcus said carefully, his voice steady despite the growing audience. "But I'm trying to tell you that I heard something wrong with the engine. Something serious." Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound was sharp and dismissive, like breaking glass. "Oh, really? And I suppose you're some kind of expert on McLaren P1s? Did you get your degree from YouTube University?" The elderly man at the next pump nudged his wife and whispered something behind his hand. The young mother had stopped wrestling with the gas cap and was openly staring now, her two children pressing their faces against the car windows to get a better look at the confrontation. "Ma'am, please," Marcus tried again, taking a half step back to give her space. "I know how this looks, but..." "You know how this looks?" Victoria's voice rose an octave. "It looks like some minimum wage gas jockey thinks he can intimidate me into believing I need his expertise. It looks like you're trying to scam me into paying for repairs that don't exist." Marcus felt something inside him recoil. He'd faced this kind of assumption before, the automatic dismissal, the presumption that his current circumstances defined his entire worth. But it never got easier, especially when innocent bystanders were watching him get torn down in public. "I'm not trying to scam anyone," he said quietly. "I'm trying to help you avoid a catastrophic engine failure." "Catastrophic engine failure?" Victoria's laugh was even sharper now, cutting through the evening air. "Do you have any idea what kind of maintenance this car receives? I have a team of certified McLaren technicians who inspect every bolt, every sensor, every component. This car was serviced just last week by people who actually know what they're doing." The crowd was growing now. A trucker had pulled up to the diesel pump and was leaning against his cab, arms crossed, watching the drama unfold. Two teenagers in a beat-up Honda had abandoned their car entirely and were recording everything on their phones, probably already planning their TikTok captions. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, could sense the mix of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment radiating from the growing audience. Some looked sympathetic, others seemed to be enjoying the free entertainment. All of them were judging him, measuring him, finding him wanting next to this polished, powerful woman who wore confidence like armor. "Look," Victoria continued, stepping closer until Marcus could smell her expensive perfume, something French and complex that probably cost more than his monthly rent. "I don't know what kind of game you're running here, but I'm not playing. Maybe in this little town, people are impressed when the gas station attendant pretends to know about luxury cars. Maybe they even fall for whatever con you're trying to pull. But I didn't build a billion-dollar company by falling for obvious scams." The words, "billion-dollar company," rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Marcus heard someone whisper, "Did she say billion?" And suddenly the dynamic shifted. It wasn't just a confrontation anymore, it was a performance, with Victoria Sterling as the star and Marcus Reed as the supporting player in his own humiliation. "Ma'am," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper now, "I'm not trying to con you. I'm trying to save your engine." "Save my engine?" Victoria's eyebrows arched with theatrical disbelief. "From what, exactly? And don't tell me you can diagnose problems just by listening. That's something out of a movie, not real life." But even as she spoke, the faint rattle from the McLaren's engine seemed to grow slightly louder, as if the car itself was trying to prove Marcus right. It was still subtle, still the kind of sound that most people would dismiss as normal engine noise, but it was definitely getting worse. Marcus heard it clearly, and his heart sank. Time was running out, and this woman was too proud, too convinced of her own infallibility, to listen to reason. He'd seen this before, too, owners so invested in their image of perfection that they'd rather risk disaster than admit they might have missed something. "Please," he said one more time, ignoring the phones pointed in his direction and the whispered commentary from the crowd. "Just let me show you what I'm hearing. It won't take 30 seconds, and if I'm wrong, I'll apologize publicly and pay for your gas." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been curiosity. Then she shook her head firmly. "I don't need your apologies or your gas money," she said, turning away dismissively. "What I need is for you to stay away from my car and do your job. Fill the tank, take my payment, and keep your amateur mechanical opinions to yourself." Marcus watched Victoria turn her back on him with the finality of a judge dismissing a case. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse slightly, the immediate drama seemingly over, but several people lingered, sensing there might be more to come. The teenagers with their phones had moved closer, apparently hoping for a sequel to whatever viral moment they thought they just captured. "Ma'am, please," Marcus called after her, his voice carrying a note of genuine urgency that made a few heads turn back in his direction. "I know you think I'm trying to pull something, but I'm not. That sound, it's going to get worse." Victoria paused at her car door, her manicured fingers already wrapped around the handle. For a moment, Marcus thought she might actually listen. Then she turned back to face him, and the expression on her face was colder than winter rain. "You just don't give up, do you?" she said loud enough that everyone in the vicinity could hear clearly. "Let me explain something to you about how this works. I pay certified professionals, people with actual training and credentials, to maintain my vehicles. These aren't backyard mechanics working out of some strip mall garage. They're McLaren factory technicians who know more about this car than the people who built it." The trucker by the diesel pump snorted with amusement, and Marcus felt heat creep up his collar again. Victoria seemed to draw energy from the audience, her voice gaining theatrical flair as she continued her performance. "My personal mechanic team," she emphasized the words like they carried special weight, "maintains this car flawlessly. Every component is inspected with precision instruments that cost more than most cars. Every fluid is analyzed, every tolerance is measured to the micron. So forgive me if I'm not particularly impressed by someone who thinks he can diagnose complex mechanical problems with his ears." Marcus took a deep breath, trying to summon the patience that had gotten him through 15 years of dealing with difficult clients and skeptical car owners. Back in his racing days, he'd learned that sometimes you had to let people make their own mistakes. But this felt different. This felt personal, not because of Victoria's condescension, but because he genuinely didn't want to see such a beautiful machine destroyed. "I understand about your mechanics," he said, keeping his voice level and respectful despite the burning embarrassment. "They probably are the best. But timing chain stretch is something that can develop quickly, especially in high-performance engines. It might not have been there during the last service." "Timing chain stretch?" Victoria's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Now you're just throwing around technical terms to try to sound credible. What's next? Are you going to tell me about flux capacitor degradation?" The crowd chuckled at that, and even Marcus had to admit it was a good line. But the humor died in his throat as he heard the McLaren's engine note change slightly. The rattle was becoming more pronounced now, still subtle but definitely audible if you knew what to listen for. "You're looking for an excuse to seem knowledgeable about something you couldn't possibly afford," Victoria continued, clearly enjoying her position as the victor in this public confrontation. "It's actually kind of sad, in a way. This desperate need to prove you're more than just." She gestured vaguely at the gas station, at his uniform, at everything that represented his current circumstances. "More than just this." Marcus felt the words like a physical blow, but what hurt worse was the murmur of agreement from parts of the crowd. He could see it in their faces, the assumption that because he worked at a gas station, because he wore a name tag and pumped gas for a living, he couldn't possibly know anything about sophisticated machinery. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just trying to prevent you from having a very expensive problem. The only problem I have," Victoria shot back, "is someone who won't take no for an answer. My car runs perfectly. Listen to it." She gestured toward the McLaren, its engine purring with what sounded like mechanical perfection to untrained ears. But Marcus could hear the dissonance underneath, like a symphony with one instrument slightly out of tune. The elderly couple at the next pump had finished fueling and were climbing back into their Buick, but they rolled their windows down to continue watching. The young mother had given up all pretense of dealing with her own gas and was leaning against her minivan, completely absorbed in the drama. "Sounds perfect to me," the trucker called out helpfully. "Smooth as silk." Victoria smiled triumphantly. "Thank you. See? Everyone else can hear that it's running beautifully." Marcus reluctantly stepped back toward the gas pump, feeling defeated. He'd done everything he could short of physically restraining her, and she wasn't going to listen. The crowd was clearly on her side, the successful businesswoman versus the delusional gas station attendant who thought he knew better than professional mechanics. But as Victoria climbed back into her car, adjusting her rearview mirror and checking her phone for messages, the McLaren's timing chain continued its steady deterioration. The microscopic tolerances that made the engine so powerful also made it incredibly fragile when things went wrong. And things were definitely going wrong. Marcus grabbed the fuel nozzle and began filling the tank, trying to ignore the whispered comments from the lingering spectators. Some were sympathetic. He caught fragments like, "Poor guy," and "just trying to help." But others were less kind. He heard, "Knows his place now," and "some people don't know when to quit." As the premium fuel flowed into the McLaren's tank, Marcus found himself hoping desperately that he was wrong. That maybe the sound he heard was something harmless, something that wouldn't lead to catastrophic failure. But his 15 years of experience told him otherwise. The timing chain was failing, and when it went, it would take the entire engine with it. The fuel pump clicked off with a decisive snap, indicating the McLaren's tank was full. Marcus replaced the nozzle with mechanical precision, his movements automatic despite the turmoil in his mind. He'd done everything he could, short of physically preventing Victoria from driving away. Now all he could do was hope that maybe, somehow, the car would make it to her destination before the inevitable happened. Victoria was already back in the driver's seat, her phone pressed to her ear as she resumed her earlier conversation. Through the open window, Marcus could hear fragments of her discussion about market projections and quarterly earnings. She seemed to have dismissed the entire confrontation as nothing more than an annoying interruption to her evening. "Jennifer, sorry about that delay," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to having their time respected. "Just had to deal with a local situation. Now, where were we on the Asia-Pacific rollout?" Marcus began walking toward the store to process her payment, but something made him pause. The McLaren's engine note had changed again, and this time the difference was more pronounced. What had been a whisper was becoming a murmur, and what had been barely perceptible was edging toward noticeable. The trucker seemed to hear it too. He cocked his head slightly, frowning as he tried to identify the source of the sound. "That car sounds a little rough," he said to nobody in particular. The elderly man helping his wife into their Buick stopped and listened for a moment. "Doesn't sound quite right, does it, Martha?" But Victoria, absorbed in her phone call and insulated by the car's luxury interior, remained oblivious to the growing chorus of mechanical distress. She gestured emphatically as she spoke, completely focused on her business discussion. Marcus felt his stomach clench with anticipation. He'd seen this moment before, the calm before the mechanical storm. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, knowing exactly what was about to happen but being powerless to prevent it. The teenagers with their phones had started recording again, apparently sensing that something interesting was about to unfold. One of them nudged the other and pointed at the McLaren. "Dude, does that sound weird to you?" "Yeah, kind of rattly." Victoria wrapped up her call and reached for the gear selector, preparing to put the car in drive. She glanced up and caught Marcus staring at her through the windshield, and her expression hardened with annoyance. "Is there a problem with my payment?" she called out through the open window. "No, ma'am," Marcus replied, his voice tight with tension. "Just please be careful." Victoria's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Careful of what? My perfectly maintained car? Don't worry, I think I can handle." Clank. The sound erupted from the McLaren's engine bay like a gunshot, sharp and metallic and absolutely unmistakable. It was the sound of precision engineering failing catastrophically, of metal components that should never touch suddenly making violent contact. Victoria's laugh died in her throat. Her eyes widened with shock as the car's smooth idle suddenly became erratic, the engine stumbling and coughing like it was choking on its own mechanical precision. "What the?" she started to say, but another clank interrupted her, this one even louder than the first. The engine began to sputter, its once perfect rhythm dissolving into chaos. The sophisticated computer systems that managed the McLaren's 12 cylinders started throwing warning lights across the dashboard like a Christmas tree having an electrical malfunction. Every head in the gas station turned toward the sound. The murmur of conversation died completely, replaced by the terrible noise of a $1 million engine eating itself alive. Victoria's hands flew to the steering wheel, gripping it with white knuckles as she stared at the cascade of warning lights. Her composed, authoritative demeanor cracked like ice under pressure, revealing genuine panic underneath. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine's mechanical death throes. "This can't be happening." Marcus was already moving toward the car, his earlier humiliation forgotten in the face of mechanical emergency. This was what he'd been trained for, what 15 years of experience had prepared him to handle. "Ma'am," he called out, raising his voice to be heard over the engine noise. "You need to shut it off right now. If you keep running it, you're going to destroy the entire motor." Victoria looked up at him with an expression that was part terror, part disbelief. The woman who had dismissed him so condescendingly just minutes earlier was now faced with the reality that he'd been right all along. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaking. "It was running perfectly. My mechanics said." Another violent clank from the engine cut her off, and this time it was accompanied by a grinding noise that made everyone within earshot wince. The teenagers' phones were recording everything, capturing what was probably the most expensive mechanical failure they'd ever witnessed. "Please," Marcus said, stepping closer to the car. "Turn off the engine. Right now. Every second you wait makes it worse." Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. Her hands shook as she reached for the ignition, but she seemed frozen by indecision and panic. "I need to get to my meeting," she said weakly, as if stating her schedule could somehow override the laws of mechanical physics. "I have investors waiting. This car has to work." "Ma'am," Marcus said gently but firmly, "if you don't shut it off now, this car will never work again. The timing chain has failed, and if it breaks completely, it'll destroy the entire engine. That's not a repair, that's a replacement. And in a car like this..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone present understood the implications. Victoria stared at him for a long moment, her earlier arrogance replaced by desperate vulnerability. Can you fix it?" Marcus looked into Victoria's panicked eyes and saw something he recognized. The desperate hope of someone watching their prized possession die before their eyes. He'd seen that exact expression countless times in his previous life, when million-dollar race cars suffered catastrophic failures and team owners faced financial ruin. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Turn off the engine first. Every second it runs now is making things worse." Victoria's hands trembled as she reached for the ignition. The moment the engine died, an eerie silence fell over the gas station. The sudden absence of mechanical noise was almost as shocking as the failure itself had been. "I need to get some tools," Marcus said, already moving toward the store. "And I need you to pop the hood." The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the drama of the moment. The teenagers had their phones out, recording everything, while the trucker and the elderly couple exchanged knowing looks. Even the young mother had corralled her children to watch what was clearly going to be either a miracle or a very expensive demonstration of why you shouldn't trust gas station mechanics. Marcus disappeared into the store and emerged 30 seconds later carrying a red toolbox that looked surprisingly professional for a gas station. But what really caught everyone's attention was the way he moved. Gone was the deferential posture of a service worker, replaced by the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He set the toolbox down beside the McLaren and opened it with practiced efficiency. Inside, arranged with almost surgical precision, were tools that clearly hadn't come from the gas station's maintenance supplies. Chrome-plated wrenches, precision screwdrivers, and diagnostic equipment that looked more expensive than most people's cars. "Where did you get those?" Victoria asked, her voice still shaky. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned over the engine bay, his trained eye scanning the exotic machinery with the kind of systematic approach that came from years of professional experience. His movements were economical and precise, like a surgeon preparing for a critical operation. "The timing chain tensioner has failed," he said, pointing to a specific component deep in the engine bay. "When that happens, the chain starts slapping against the guides, which is what you heard. If it had gone much longer, the chain would have jumped time or broken completely, and then..." He gestured at the entire engine. "Total loss." Probably $400,000 minimum to rebuild, assuming you could even find replacement parts. Victoria stared at him with a mixture of amazement and confusion. How do you know all this? I mean, specifically know this? Marcus selected a specialized tool from his kit and began working with the fluid movements of someone who had done this exact repair hundreds of times. Because I've rebuilt this engine before. Multiple times, actually. That's impossible, Victoria said. There are only 375 P1s in existence. The chances of you having worked on one are chassis number 247, Marcus said without looking up from his work. Team Falcone's backup car for the 2019 season. Chassis 089, privately owned by Hassan Al-Rashid. Chassis 156, which we converted for track-only use after the owner crashed it at Spa. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the teenagers had stopped their whispered commentary, sensing that something significant was happening. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. You worked for Team Falcone? The racing team? Lead mechanic, Marcus said, his hands never pausing in their work. 15 years in motorsport, the last 8 specializing in McLaren powertrains. Before that, I worked for Mercedes-AMG in Formula One, then moved to GT racing when I wanted something more stable. He located the problem and began making the delicate adjustments needed to realign the timing chain. His movements were so fluid and confident that watching him work was almost hypnotic. But what are you doing here? Victoria asked, gesturing at the gas station around them. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, focusing on a particularly delicate procedure that required absolute precision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. My daughter Emma was diagnosed with leukemia 3 years ago, he said simply. Racing means constant travel, being away for weeks at a time. I couldn't do that to her, especially not when she needed me most. So I found work that let me stay home, be present for her treatments, pick her up from school every day. The silence that followed was profound. Victoria felt something twist in her chest, a combination of shame, admiration, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Is she? Victoria started, then stopped, not sure how to finish the question. In remission, Marcus said, a small smile crossing his face for the first time that evening. 2 years clean. Toughest kid I've ever met. He made a final adjustment and straightened up, wiping his hands on a clean rag from his toolbox. There. The tensioner is reset and properly adjusted. It should hold until you can get to a proper McLaren service center, but you need to keep the RPMs under 4,000 and avoid heavy acceleration. Victoria stared at the engine, then at Marcus, then back at the engine. That's it. You fixed it? Temporarily, Marcus corrected. This is an emergency repair. You'll need a complete timing chain service within the next few hundred miles, but it'll get you to your meeting and back home safely. The murmur from the crowd was no longer skeptical, it was impressed. The trucker was nodding with professional respect, and even the teenagers seemed awed by what they'd witnessed. Marcus began packing his tools with the same methodical precision he'd used to unpack them. You can start her up now. She should run smooth. Victoria turned the key with trembling fingers, and the McLaren's engine came to life with a purr so smooth it might have been a completely different car. The harsh mechanical violence of minutes before had been replaced by the sophisticated whisper of precision engineering working exactly as intended. She sat in stunned silence for a moment, listening to the perfect idle, watching the dashboard lights return to their normal, reassuring glow. The contrast was so dramatic it felt almost surreal, like waking up from a nightmare to find everything exactly as it should be. How much do I owe you? She asked, reaching for her purse with hands that were still slightly unsteady. Marcus was closing his toolbox, each tool returning to its designated place with the methodical care of someone who had learned to respect his equipment. He looked up at her question and shook his head. Nothing, he said simply. I couldn't take payment for something like this. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. Nothing? You just saved me hundreds of thousands of dollars. Maybe more. I just didn't want to see a beautiful machine destroyed, Marcus replied, hefting the toolbox and preparing to head back into the store. Cars like this, they're works of art. It would have been a tragedy to lose one to something preventable. The crowd that had gathered was beginning to disperse, but slowly, reluctantly, as if they sensed they'd witnessed something significant. The teenagers were already uploading their videos, probably adding captions about the gas station mechanic who saved $1 million car. The trucker gave Marcus a respectful nod as he climbed back into his cab, and the elderly couple waved goodbye with obvious admiration. But Victoria remained frozen in her seat, her mind reeling as she tried to process everything that had happened in the last 20 minutes. The assumptions she'd made, the words she'd spoken, the public humiliation she'd inflicted on a man who had been trying to help her, it all came crashing down on her with uncomfortable clarity. "Wait," she called out as Marcus reached the store entrance. "Please." He turned back, his expression patient but guarded. Victoria climbed out of the McLaren, her expensive heels clicking on the concrete as she approached him. Up close, she could see the details she'd missed before, the calloused hands that spoke of years working with tools, the quiet dignity in his posture, the intelligence in his eyes that she'd been too arrogant to notice. "I owe you an apology," she said, the words coming harder than any boardroom negotiation she'd ever conducted. "More than an apology. I was wrong. About everything." Marcus studied her face for a moment, then nodded slowly. "People make assumptions. It happens." "No," Victoria said firmly. "It's more than that. I assumed that because you work here, because of how you look, because of where I found you, that you couldn't possibly know more than I did about cars. Or about anything, really. That was ignorant and unfair." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond a single evening at a gas station. "You gave up a career in professional racing to take care of your daughter," Victoria continued, her voice softer now. That's not something many people would do. The sacrifice, the love it represents." Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Emma's worth more than any career. Besides, racing will always be there. Childhood only happens once." Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of priorities she'd never really considered. Her own rise to success had required sacrificing relationships, missing family gatherings, choosing business over almost everything else. She told herself it was necessary, that success demanded such choices. But standing here, looking at a man who had chosen love over ambition and seemed genuinely at peace with that decision, she wondered if she'd been lying to herself. "Your daughter's lucky to have you," she said quietly. "I'm the lucky one," Marcus replied. "She taught me what really matters." Victoria glanced back at her McLaren, its engine idling smoothly in the fluorescent light. The car that had represented status and achievement and personal triumph suddenly seemed less important than it had an hour ago. "The investor meeting," she said, more to herself than to Marcus. "I was so worried about being late, about making the right impression. But if you hadn't stopped me, if you hadn't insisted on helping despite how I treated you, you would have made it maybe 5 miles before the engine seized completely," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "Probably would have happened right in front of your investors. That would have been a harder impression to recover from." Victoria laughed despite herself, a sound with more genuine humor than her earlier sharp dismissals. "You're probably right." She pulled out her business card and handed it to him. "I know you're happy here, doing what you're doing. But if you ever change your mind, if you ever want to get back into the automotive world, Sterling Dynamics is moving into electric vehicle development. We could use someone with your expertise." Marcus took the card and looked at it for a moment before sliding it into his pocket. "I appreciate that. Really. But Emma's still got 2 years of high school left, and I promised her I'd be at every soccer game." Victoria smiled, the first genuine smile she'd given all evening. "She's lucky to have you," she repeated. As she climbed back into the McLaren, Victoria caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror. She looked the same as always, perfectly composed, impeccably dressed, every detail calculated for maximum impact. But something behind her eyes had changed, some small shift in perspective that she couldn't quite define yet. The drive to her investor meeting was smooth and uneventful, the McLaren performing flawlessly thanks to Marcus's expert intervention. But as the miles passed, Victoria found herself thinking less about quarterly projections and market penetration strategies, and more about a man who had chosen love over ambition and found peace in that choice. By the time she reached the city, Victoria Sterling had made a decision that would have surprised her earlier self. Success, she realized, didn't always have to come at the expense of everything else.